Hello, everyone, and welcome to the launch event of the IRM's Environmental and Social Governance Special Interest Group. My name is Anita Panwani, and I will be facilitating the session for you today. For those of you who are new to the IRM, we are a professional membership body specializing in education, training, thought leadership. The focus of this particular special interest group is the governance of purpose-driven organizations with the intention of fulfilling their social responsibilities in an ethical and sustainable manner. And by that we mean the economic, the social, the environmental considerations of both future generations as well as current generations. Now, the backdrop you may have seen on the starter slide is very much the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Now, you as an individual or the organizations that you work with may be supporting the UN SDGs in respect of ending poverty or hunger, ensuring good health, well-being, a quality education for all. You may believe in reducing inequality and ensuring everyone has access to clean water and sanitation, affordable and clean energy, and decent work. The UN SDGs are really about ensuring economic growth across industry, infrastructure, cities, and communities in a sustainable and responsible manner. And I believe that the environmental crises, as well as the global health crisis, illustrate why we need strong institutions and partnerships to tackle the global challenges, the global risks that we face. And this has really informed our thinking at the IRM in terms of ESG. We've been, Amber's been involved in various different groups that have been involved in the guidance of organizations in relation to their governance. One of those has been the involvement in the new international standard, the ISO 37000 standard on the governance of organizations. And on a personal level, that involved a whole host of international community experts in governance. And on a personal level, it broadened my perspective, both of the ethical dimension and the international dimension. So for each organization, there will be challenges. There will be a number of stakeholders' interests to consider. And the way in which the organization handles the economic, the social, the environmental considerations may be a reflection of the values, and it may be a question of prioritizing financial returns at one end. It may be a question of balancing financial returns with social outcomes. At the other end, it may be a question of maximizing social outcomes. So on that note, I will really hand over to our panel of experts to give their views on those opening remarks. Just to let you know, we have 4 speakers. Each will speak for about 7 minutes, and then we'll move to the Q&A, where you'll have the opportunity through the Q&A function to ask your questions. So it's with great honor we introduce our first speaker, Vasuki. Vasuki Shastri is an Associate Fellow at the Asia Pacific Program of the Royal Institute of International Affairs, more commonly known as Chatham House. Vasuki is an ESG advisor and former Global Head of Public Affairs and Sustainability at Standard Chartered Bank. Vasuki will be addressing changes in the social context and the impact it's having on organizations in relation to ESG. So over to you, Vasuki.
Thanks a lot, Anita. Thank you for inviting me. Thanks a lot to the IRM for organizing this event. I want to focus, since I'm speaking to an audience of risk professionals, I want to focus a little bit on how ESG, specifically on the social aspects, are being implemented in companies. What are some of the challenges that I see, both in terms of disclosure as well as living up to the full spirit and intent of what the organization is setting to do. And I think one point of comparison one can make at the start is if you look at the environmental pillar, I think 5 or 6 years ago, that was fairly underdeveloped. You had this big global debate and urgency on climate change, but I think the corporate sector was struggling to figure out how to integrate climate thinking into the organization. And I think we've come a long way, and I think we can all, of course, there's tremendous scope for disagreement in thinking that many corporate promises made on the environment. We'll have to wait and see how much of that will actually be implemented. There's all this accusation on brown washing. But at least with the environment, you've got a global platform, you've got countries coming together through the UN and this conference of parties. You don't have any of this in the social sphere, which really creates, I think, a lot of challenges where there's a risk of fragmentation and volcanisation of risks and approaches. Right, so let me just cite two examples of where I see this fragmentation. One is, equality, diversity, and inclusion, which is a very key component of the social pillar. This is seen as primarily a human resource issue. While I don't disagree with the proposition that human resource departments in companies should worry about equality, diversity, inclusion, and voice. But really, in many ways, this speaks to the heart of the organization's values, vision, and purpose, and cannot be siloed away into one function. And therefore, directors and the investors and everyone taking comfort that one key component of the social pillar is actually being addressed. Similarly, I see a great deal of risks in supply chains, where again, this is regarded as a procurement problem. The procurement departments, of course, handle supply chains, but the complexity of supply chains, the fact that many abuses can go unchecked over a period of years, completely undermining and diluting any social promises that an organization can make. That again begs the question, do we need a set of global standards? I think it's going to be very difficult to harmonize across countries, but certainly I think a set of multinational corporations operating in large complex markets, I think there is scope for some harmonization. And we're beginning to see this, Bangladesh and garment industry. There used to be a lot of concern over worker abuse and worker safety. And I think certainly the garment industry has come a long way in addressing some of these concerns. So, if you have a harmonized approach, what would that look like? And I would say every harmonized social approach should have 4 components. In bringing all the elements together, there should be a focus on disclosure. Obviously, much of this has to do with non-financial disclosure. So you've got to think about what kind of standard setters can appear in this space in order to build those standards, build uniform approaches across all the social activities. Second focus really is manage, and this is where I think the risk function can play an important role. I think investors and external stakeholders need to be provided with comfort that risks are being managed within supply chains in the human resource space. And I've noticed in my work that the risk function is very, very reluctant. It was very reluctant to take on climate and environmental risk. I think the risk function is really dragged into really recognizing that climate was a principal risk for many organizations. I see similar turbulence in the risk function and saying this is really not their area of expertise. How can you develop these risk typologies? But I think ultimately this is appropriately with risk, where they have to develop those typologies, provide comfort that at least the S part of ESG, those risks are being managed. Measurement, I think, is a huge issue. Measurement in terms of, so you've got a basic set of social parameters that are being measured at the moment. What we really need to do is to go one level down and try and figure out, for example, if there are supply chain risk issues that emerge during the year, there has to be a quantitative and a qualitative analysis provided so that investors can make a judgment on how these risks are being managed. And final really is aspirations. I think you need companies to be bolder, put a little bit more vision in how they manage their staff, how they manage their suppliers, what kind of contributions they are making to society. And when you put these aspirations, they have to come with a set of KPIs so that investors and the general public can measure at the end of each year whether these companies are progressing or not. So to conclude, in the social sphere, it's very difficult, I think, to get countries together like the UN Conference of Parties. But I think the corporate sector can, at least large multinational corporations operating in many, many markets across the globe, I think they have an opportunity to come together to be standard setters. And even if many rules do not originate in the host countries where they operate, and I think if everyone agrees to these global standards, I think we can make tremendous progress in driving social impact. I shall pause here, Anita.
Thank you very much. And thank you for putting the risk professional and risk management at the heart of your thinking there. And I think it's very much about pulling the viewfinder beyond enterprise-wide risk to look at the whole value chain, particularly as you touched on in terms of the supply chain. Thank you very much, Vasuki. We now turn to Hannah Wood. Hannah is Climate and Environment Director at UBS Optimus Foundation. She's going to cover the role of philanthropy in driving change in ESG. Over to you, Hannah.
Thanks, Anita. It's a pleasure to be here. So as Vasuki mentioned, there has been unprecedented momentum in the ESG space in recent years, and that's led to high expectations of progress and increasing pressure on corporates to invest in their ESG risk assessment and policy making, as well as the demands for more credible disclosures and the challenge of turning very publicly declared national and corporate net zero pledges into real-time impactful action. But what role does philanthropy play in driving these changes in ESG? Well, whereas ESG is a set of criteria, philanthropy and impact investing is a strategy, not focused on financial gain as much as positive social and environmental change. And these days, philanthropy, impact investing, and the ESG market have matured and grown such that people can build an entirely diverse portfolio aligned to impact in some way, and use philanthropy to leverage greater impact, to minimize risk, and to identify opportunity. So innovative philanthropic funding is an important pre-step in catalyzing investment, identifying impactful programs to be made ready for further forms of ESG investing, as well as identifying those that are not yet investment ready, which is equally important. And in these respects, philanthropy has two important roles. Firstly, signalling, in that an early philanthropic investment which takes that first loss in high risk position can indicate a degree of legitimacy. The venture is worthy of risk, and this can unlock additional funding. And if early investors are reputable, like a sophisticated philanthropic foundation, the grant can improve credibility and strongly enhance the visibility for that grantee. But the second and arguably more important role for today is that of risk reduction, because early stage philanthropy does lower risk for other investors and enables support for initiatives that otherwise may not meet strict investment criteria. Traditionally, foundations will provide donations in the form of simple grants or loans, and these are the primary tools that most people think of when it comes to philanthropy. But in recent years, new structures for deployment of philanthropic capital are being employed to leverage funds far more effectively, taking into account the specific financing needs of the grantee. To claim that this combination of social and financial returns and investing approach is new wouldn't be entirely fair. In the late Victorian era, we had percentage philanthropy, where philanthropic capital was used to build social housing that was then rented at sub-market rates to working class tenants. And that transfers to nowadays, where philanthropy is growing at pace. In 2020, despite or maybe because of the pandemic, global philanthropic giving totaled approximately $750 billion. And total giving is expected to rise by 5.7% this year. But this is still far from enough to meet the needs of the UN SDGs, where the estimated annual funding gap is around $2.5 trillion. So to do that, we're going to need far more effective tools that are targeted at achieving outcomes, not simply outputs. Philanthropy needs to support interventions across the impact spectrum, from traditional philanthropy to investing for or with impact and into sustainable investment itself, an approach using impact as the basis for everything, no matter which instrument is used. One such tool is the impact bond, or more specifically, a development impact bond, or a DIB. So a DIB is a results-based contract in which a philanthropist will provide the upfront capital for a social or environmental initiative, and that initiative is implemented by an entity like a non-profit or a social enterprise. The results are evaluated by an independent entity, and if previously agreed targets are met, then an outcome payer, such as a bilateral agency or foundation, will pay back the philanthropist, including the return. Where traditional grant-based programs monitor inputs like the number of teachers trained or the number of medical centres built, this does not always evidence genuine impact like improved learning outcomes or enhanced maternal health. But a DIB, by contrast, shifts the focus from inputs to outcomes using a flexible framework which allows for innovation and creativity. The benefits are considerable because implementing organisations are incentivised to improve their outcomes and adapt their model to maximise results. So a quick example is our UBS Optimus Foundation in 2014 launched the first DIB in rural India. The objective was to reduce the gender gap by getting more girls into school and learning. Optimus provided the initial investment to an NGO, Educate Girls, who then implemented their innovative techniques. And a third-party evaluator monitored ongoing enrolment and learning outcomes with a series of randomly controlled trials. When the program hits its success targets, the outcome payer, in this case Children Investment Fund Foundation, will repay the initial investment. So in this way, the success of the program enables Optimus, as the initial risk paper, to receive the investment back, plus a return on investment, which is linked to the performance of the program. And in this way, philanthropic capital is then reinvested back into the program or to other programs, which doubles or trebles its impact. The upsides for funders like government are significant because as an outcome payer, governments now only pay on success, and the focus on results gives them justification for spending to taxpayers. And it completely removes the risk because they don't pay if the innovation is unsuccessful. So to conclude, a philanthropic investor like a foundation just has to show some pioneering spirit. We have to be open to experiment where a traditional investor may not. It is a risky game, but we often have experience and a bit more freedom in a sector where a more risk-averse investor may not have access. So in practice, this means that we need to go beyond classical grant funding, dare to fill the initial financing gap. And in this way, we can enable philanthropists to become a risk catalyst for good and jumpstart the emergence of these new ESG investment products. Thanks, Anita.
Thank you very much, Hannah. So as a risk professional, that's enabled me to focus on outcomes, positive social outcomes, and minimizing potential negative social outcomes. And thank you for that example as well. It made it very real. We now move on to Alex Heinzen. Alex is Chief Risk and Sustainability Officer with the Argo Group, former IRM Chair and Non-Executive Board Director. Alex is going to address ESG through the risk mirror, setting a risk-based ESG strategy for an ESG intelligent organization. Over to you, Alex.
Thank you, Anita, and good morning, everybody. So I'm going to argue that the framework for an ESG intelligent organization would not start where most people start. Unfortunately, a lot of people are under pressure and they feel they need to report externally. And I think we need to take a step back and think, okay, why are we doing this? And so I'm going to offer a framework with 4 steps, starting with context, then strategy, program, and finally metrics. So just to jump into that, step 1, context. So the question is, why are we doing this? And I think the question needs to think in terms of stakeholders. What matters to whom, and who has most influence over you, and what do they expect? And obviously that varies organization by organization. An obvious one would be shareholders if you're that kind of organization, but equally ESG and credit rating agencies, employees are a pretty important one, both current and potential, and your business partners and anyone else that has influence over you, such as regulators. So I think knowing what people expect of you is a good start. Being a risk professional, we have to think about threats and opportunities. So what could go wrong? And what needs to go right. And I think in both contexts, think brand and think reputation, and think also about your social license to operate. I think it's incredibly important from a risk management point of view that we think about priorities. I can tell you that being in this seat, you cannot satisfy everyone, even some of the time. So this is about making some tough choices. You need to prioritize. It's a really simple example. There are 17 UN SDGs. No one can address all of them. Pick 2 or 3 and do a good job. So my point, and I'll make this several times, is take a position. It's not going to be happy for everybody, but take a position. That's what risk management's about. 2, strategy. So this is about linking all this to your purpose and mission as an organization. What does it mean for you? And think also about culture and values, about how you do it. I would argue you need a board and executive debate on this and sponsorship. So ideally you have a board sponsor, certainly an executive sponsor, and there is a way of feeding this into the routine decision-making bodies of the organization, either a specific committee or integrated into other committees. Again, I'm going to come back to taking a position. There's going to be trade-offs. You'll need to, but I think two concepts I've found helpful. One is ambition. So where do we need to be and why? And the other is very familiar to risk professionals, risk appetite. What can we live with? And in another context, a group I'm involved in called the Risk Officer Sustainability Forum, it was argued, but the risk professional was the arbiter of good enough for now. So that's not my phrase, but I think it's quite helpful because this is a journey, it's rapidly changing, and you will have to revisit your strategy. Thirdly, program. So let's get practical. What are the objectives? What's the project plan? What are the milestones and deliverables? None of this is new. It's all about change management. But very, very important, accountabilities. Who is going to do what by when? And think about how that fits into corporate and personal objectives on the basis that what gets measured gets rewarded and gets done. But that's also a threat. If you measure and set the wrong targets, you will get them, and then you'll have to live with them. So fourthly, and I'm not going to dwell on this, is metrics. But think about internal key performance indicators, dashboards, and reports. What do people need to know when? And then think finally about where most people start, which is external disclosure. So in summary, a sensible ESG framework would have 4 steps: context, strategy, program, and metrics. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And Alex, you're at the heart of decision making in supporting governance within your organization, but also taking a program-based perspective, which is focused on outcomes. So all the best of risk management and risk governance. Thank you for that. We now turn to Paloma. Paloma is founder and chair of Sustainability Hub, former director of governance Save the Children International, former deputy division chief of the Public Governance Directorate of OECD, and now professor at the IE School of Global and Public Affairs. Paloma will be covering social impact from ESG to purpose-driven organizations. Over to you, Paloma.
Thank you so much, Anita, and thank you to all of you who have connected this morning to talk with us about this topic. I am going to share my screen. I hope this will work. Is it working now already, Anita? Can you confirm? Yeah.
Just turn it into the screen mode.
Okay, just give me 1 second so that I can do that. Yeah. So before I go into that, I think my presentation is actually going to be nicely on what Hannah was saying when she mentioned the word outcomes. The truth is to talk a little bit about context first, that we need a lot of investment. We need to mobilize a lot of capital to address common challenges as a global society. Just to name a few, just to meet the Sustainable Development Goals, we're talking about $5 to $7 billion a year. To address climate change, we're talking about 3 to 5 trillion through 2050. And these numbers can be questioned, but regardless of the methodology, we are moving into the trillions of dollars conversation to address global challenges. And the problem is not, frankly, the money, at least not in the private sector side. because we are in a context of overabundance of capital, where assets under management have gone to over 110 trillion today. So I want to talk to you today about the opportunity of ESG and the challenges of using ESG as a catalyzer for responsible investment, and in doing so, achieving some of those outcomes that have to do with these global challenges, SDGs, inequality, environment, etc. So it is true that responsible investment has been increasing tremendously, and part of it has been driven by the reliance we have increasingly seen on environmental, social, and governance indicators, which you know already. In practice, where can we see that? Where we can see an incredible rise, for example, of climate-aware funds. You look at the numbers of how much they have increased in just a few years, really less than a decade, or in the incredible amount of new sustainability indexes that, linking to what Alex was saying, have driven this rush to report and to create sustainability reports and meet those indicators to then be present in these sustainability indexes and capture capital. So my question is, and what I wanted to discuss with you today is whether the data we're using today, ESG data that underpins this responsible investment, is good enough, and is it measure what we need to achieve those outcomes that I was saying at the beginning. I think there are two issues today that we need to focus on. One is the quality of the data, and the second is the relevance of the data. When we talk about the quality of the data, we need to keep in mind that ESG indicators are focused on protecting investments from financial, reputational, or regulatory risks associated with climate change, with governance, or the social realm. They are really a way of protecting the cash flows. They're not a way of measuring impact of the company's services or goods on environment or society. And that's important because we need to understand what it measures and what it doesn't. If we just simply take them for what they are, the first problem or the first challenge I think we need to understand when we talk about ESG indicators is that we have a lot of standards. I have here this image by the IMF summarizes some of them, but there are many others, not only SASB or UNPRI or the Global Reporting Initiative of the UN Global Compact of CDP. As risk management professionals, you know better than me that there are many standards, in addition to those that sectors of the economy organize to give themselves, for example, oil and gas companies or construction companies, etc. So if we have a lot of different standards, we have, as a result, a lot of different interpretations of ESG data. And in fact, there are studies that suggest that a company can, or companies report with at least 20 different metrics, indicators that have to deal, for example, with health and safety of their employees. The lack of common standards, of course, results in this variation of indicators and methodologies and data points to compare concepts that are measured by ESG. As a result, of course, there is no surprises when we try to see a correlation between ESG scores from, for example, two providers, in this case FTSE or MSCI. There is no correlation whatsoever. But there is yet another issue here, which is the transparency of the methodology used by ESG data providers, which, as you can see, at the aggregate data from public sources. To begin with, that data, as we talked about, responds to different concepts and therefore measures different metrics, but it's aggregated and then use their own proprietary methodologies, turn into indexes or lists of good performing or bad performing companies that, in fact, we have no clarity as to how they're built and therefore whether they are comparable or not. So these are some of the issues that have to do with the quality of ESG data today. As I was saying at the beginning, there is also a question of depth. If we focus on inputs and activities, again, to manage the risk against environmental or social or even governance outcomes or impacts on the company, we're not focusing on outcomes and impacts for the stakeholders, right? And I think that's where the opportunity is in the future. For example, what are the losses caused by greenhouse emissions? What are the damages caused to human health because of pollution? What is the economic loss due or provided by higher or lower rates of female employment, or the tax revenue loss due to corruption or tax evasion? If we were moving into the sphere of impact, the indicators we would need would be different. And this is happening already, at least in theory, in this project, the Impact Weighted Accounts Management Project, led by the Harvard Business School. But just to give you an example of how they do this, they compare in this case two companies, PepsiCo or Coca-Cola, and just instead of just looking at the financial statement, they weight the financial statement based on impact. In this case, the environmental cost of both companies, which is driven in the case of Coca-Cola by a higher rate of water usage for a similar product, we could argue. So if we subtract and we give a number to that environmental cost, the impact weighted account would be lower for Coca-Cola than for PepsiCo. This is just an example of where things can go, but just to summarize the ideas that I briefly presented, I think we're in a context of pressing challenges. This requires private and private collaboration and investment, and there is a lot of resources in the private sector that can be mobilized and are mobilized through responsible investment. But ESG is not a perfect answer to that. One, it has methodological issues that can be improved but need to be improved. And second, it has scope issues because we're hedging risk, but we're not looking at impact. So we first need to standardize the data. We need to create common metrics and be more transparent about what we measure. And then, of course, we need to start also in parallel, start moving the conversation further towards impact measurement, and that's how we can begin talking about a purpose-driven organization and an economy of purpose. I will leave it at this for now, Anita.
Thank you very much, Paloma, for a very clear and informative presentation. I'm tempted to start asking questions, but I think this is the point where we now bring in the audience and turn to the Q&A. So if you have questions, please put them through the Q&A function. Let's start with the question that Richard has put. Is it as simple as defining a net zero strategic objective with a risk appetite to underpin it? Is it as simple as defining a net zero strategic objective with a risk appetite to underpin it? Anyone on the panel willing to take that on, that question?
Yeah, Anita, perhaps I can jump in. Obviously, the answer is no. I think there are many examples of companies setting net zero targets, and there are two kinds of net zero targets. One is infinity, which is 2050 and 2060, and some companies are taking the responsible approach of having this interim target of 2030, 2035. And the only way this is going to work is, you can't just declare a target. You've got to indicate. In many ways, it is storytelling and narrative as to how you're going to meaningfully change your business model, because achieving net zero emissions requires a complete overhaul in the way a company does business. It starts off with simple things like in the locations where the company operates from. Is it going to move from fossil fuels to renewable energy? In its dealings with suppliers, is it going to take steps to make sure that the suppliers themselves are providing services which are carbon neutral? So, so on one hand, you've got an environmental set of indicators that the company has to adhere to, but it has to be driven by strategy, operations, and purpose. And of course, the verdict really will come in the next 5-10 years when you begin to see whether these targets really are really making sense.
Thank you very much. The next two questions, I'll take them both because they're connected. So the first one, Neil is asking, would Alex represent ESG as a singular risk area in a register relative to other principal risks? or treat it separately as a thematic process given multiple touch points with other risks? And Alex asks, are we going to be getting into more detail of the nature, types of ESG risks that organizations should be thinking about? So far, the session is about why we should be doing this, approaches for doing ESG activities, but the more useful data on types of ESG risks. So, Alex, would you be able to start on that one?
Sorry, I was muted, not by myself. Yeah, I can tell you that this is not a simple answer, but I can tell you what we've done and why. So in our risk management framework, we've actually created another category of risk, essentially called ESG risk, at the same level as financial operational risk. Now, we are a regulated insurance company, so we have regulators telling us what our framework should be, as well as us deciding. And so there are multiple pressure points in terms of how it's done. But in essence, I've defined climate risk within ESG risk, and then it has three subcategories: physical, transition, and litigation risk. And we're exposed to all three in concept because the physical risks apply if we're providing insurance on property risks, fairly obviously, but we have investments that are exposed to physical risk. Transition risk is mostly our investments, and then litigation risk is unfortunately people suing other people for having caused or misled about climate risk, and we might be their insurer. So these are the kinds of risk we're looking at. I would say there are, in essence, in a financial services company, three types of ESG risks. There's the operational side, running our own business. There is the people we choose to insure and the impact that has on our balance sheet. And then there are the people we invest in, because essentially insurance companies take a premium, hold on to it until they pay the claims, and we have to put that money somewhere, and there are choices about the impact of the companies we invest in. I have an ESG threat and opportunity register for our company. It's been running for about 4 or 5 years, and we have over 80 risks. So I don't think I'm going to be able to go through all of them. But the key point is it's threats and opportunities. There are upsides in terms of opportunities, and I would encourage people to think about that in terms of how you will get your board's attention if you say, okay, how do we make money out of the transition as well as doing good?
Isn't it in a way? Go, please, Paloma, please.
Just to complement, I of course, this is not what we were going to focus on. Maybe this is a good work plan for the next sessions, but just a comment building on what Alice was saying, there is a high industry-specific concept around ESG, and of course there is a materiality analysis and materiality standards that can help us a very useful point to hedge risk. And I also would invite companies, in addition to follow, for example, SASB materiality matrices, to look at the double materiality of not only the risk, but again, where is it that I can have more impact? You were mentioning it before also, Alex. Which are the 2 or 3 goals that I can particularly, not because I have a risk, but because I have an opportunity, focus on? So I just wanted to make that brief comment.
Thank you. Did anyone, Hannah or Vasuki, did you want to come in on that? The next question is from Mike. I'm interested in the DIBs described by Hannah. 2 questions. How large have historical investments been? And secondly, what sort of ROIs have been expected delivered?
Hi, Mike. Yeah, so I mean, the DIB's a relatively new concept. So obviously the one that I mentioned was the first one that started in 2014. We are currently working on a couple of other ones, but it is quite new, so I can't really give a sort of general overview. The original one, to give you an idea, for Educate Girls, the initial project budget was around 270,000 US dollars that was initially invested. And so the sort of levels of ROI have been repaid dependent on impact on that. So the greater the impact, the higher the interest rates that have been returned. There are other models of this that are being employed. You've got a conservation impact bond, which is focused on rhino conservation, and that's being administered through East Africa. That also has a sort of different rate of return and so on. But I suppose what I'm saying is that it's such a new concept that there aren't really generalizations, and each case is being individually thrashed out as it's being developed. A lot of it depends on the level of risk that the initial investor is prepared to take, and also the appetite of the outcome payer, like what sort of what additional investment they're prepared to pay on top of that. And so that will depend on, you know, who that is, whether it's a bilateral or a multilateral, or whether it's a philanthropic foundation. But it's really exciting space for us to be operating in, and it ties in quite nicely to a lot of what Paloma was talking about as well, because it's very much an intermediary step between the one and the other.
On that note, Paloma, we have Jason and Johannes very interested in your slides. What I would just request, if you contact me on our ESG Special Interest Group webpage, my email details are there. If you contact me, then I'll put you in touch with Paloma directly. The next question comes from Russell Price. ESG is becoming a catch for a whole variety of different activities. There seems to be little consistency in terminology or application. How big a deal do you think this is for the sector? Yes, Alex, please.
Yeah, I think the biggest challenge we've had is to educate our board on what ESG means. And obviously there are 3 words there, but depending on your stakeholders, if I go back to the start of my presentation, our different stakeholders define ESG differently. There are some that include, for example, data privacy and cybersecurity in there under social, because the concept is you're protecting your client's data. Others will include a lot of kind of supply chain type questions, or other people will focus on the investment portfolio, or kind of utilities and waste. So I think my advice is take awareness of what other people define, but you're going to have to define it for yourself. I mean, at the moment, unfortunately, there is no single definition. We may be approaching that point because it's rather esoteric, but something called the IFRS Council has announced a new International Sustainability Standards Board in, I think it was November, around COP26, and that will bring many of the standards that exist together, including SASB and TCFD, and there is some hope of a single global standard, but I'm just saying some hope. At the moment, there's probably at least 6 or 7.
Yes, Paloma.
Yeah, beyond the profession, because of my previous role on international organizations, I think it's a big problem. And it is a problem because, as the person who was asking was rightly pointing, we're using it for many things, when in reality it was meant to do one thing, which is manage non-financial risk and manage it for shareholder value. Of course, we can assume that being abiding better by the regulation, or being better managed or governed, and treating better your employees is going to result in a better behavior of the company, but we cannot assume that that is actually resulting in higher impact of the company, as I was saying. But at the moment, I think we have a problem of knowing whether this explosion of responsible investment based on ESG is actually achieving any of the results it intends to achieve, because we can compare the data. We don't have similar standards, and we're measuring different things. We cannot ensure that it's measuring what we interpret that it is. So for me, in addition, of course, at the company level, it poses a whole lots of questions and pressure to comply with all these sustainability indexes, etc. But at a macro level, there are issues of comparability, reliability, and relevance that need to be addressed.
Thank you. Jason asks, materiality has traditionally been the method used by the sustainability world to identify priorities from a risk, opportunity, and impact perspective. Context in Alex's model. We have had good success helping clients align and even integrate ERM and materiality. Let's see what do the panel envisage a world where this becomes, I can't see the end of the question. Rory, maybe you'd be able to help me on that. It's, hang on, I've got it now. I've lost that last question now.
I have it, Anita. It says, do the panel envisage a world where this becomes the norm for integrating ESG and ERM?
Thank you. Any offers?
I'm happy to start. I think there's a lot of similarity between risk assessment, risk ranking, and materiality assessment. I guess that in my mind, the difference is about the impact measure, which is not really about dollars. It's about stakeholder reactions. We've been looking at what some of our peers have been doing, and our ESG report, which we're working on right now, will come out in March, and we're going to have a materiality grid in it. So we're actually going to publish our materiality, and there's going to be two scales. There's going to be how important we think it is to our company and how important we think it is to our stakeholders. And obviously, if you do that on a high, medium, low basis, the things that are high would be the things you should be prioritizing and actioning and reporting on. So I guess the concept is, if you put it out there, then you've called it wrong, your stakeholders will tell you and you can improve. Ideally, you would talk to them beforehand, but some of these stakeholder clusters are quite disparate and hard to talk to. I mean, we regularly interact with our top 25 investors, but that's only although they may hold 80% of the shares, that's a big difference to talking to all our shareholders all the time.
And their priorities may change.
Exactly.
Lisa Khan asks, the value of an investment is no longer just about returns. Any quick wins on how we can really get companies to understand the role of impact investing? That question, and if anyone wanted to add anything to Alex's point as well.
Yeah, maybe I can go on the materiality question. And there's a risk of materiality assessments becoming cookie cutter, where people are applying some very basic, I know the SASB standard is widely followed by lots of companies, but the complexity here, I think, is twofold. If you're an asset manager investing in a diverse range of industries, your external materiality map is going to look very different from the assessment that you would do of the asset manager's own operations and activities. And I think there is what we are seeing in terms of disclosure is some very standard tools being used. And I think the SASB tool does not mean that it's one size fits all. So it really has to be, and I think investors are asking the questions of materiality assessments. And there's a risk, and I don't want to overplay the risk, but it becomes less meaningful as a tool if there isn't greater rigor put into the process.
Any other thoughts? Yes, Paloma?
Yeah, on that question on impact, that's why I wanted to show you a specific example being led right now by the Harvard Business School, the Impact Weighted Account project, because it's beginning to show a way in which we can give a numeric number, a dollar-based number, to impact in companies. And of course, it's going to take a while to make that mainstream. But the more that we can provide these types of examples where we value companies and the bottom line of the company discounts or adds the positive or negative impact on society, on health, on a host of issues to the bottom line. That's the direction where we should be going. Now, obviously, only a very small number of companies are incorporating these in their reports. But we're beginning to see this type of methodologies happen. So I think this is the future, and I think it would also lead to different forms of policy making and policies around regulation or taxation. And we're probably going to see that in the European Union around environment, for example. Should all companies be taxed equal, or if they pollute in the same industry with different levels of impact? I think it's a very, very interesting discussion, at least for policy making perspective. And for that, we need this type of analysis, and we're beginning to see examples of how that can be done, even if it's not mainstream.
Thank you. The next question really, I think, is very important, and I didn't want to sneak a question in, so thank you, Kamala, for asking this one. With social impact being at the heart of the discussion, how can the ideas coming directly from unheard voices, diverse communities with their inherent risks, untested ideas get supported?
Can I speak briefly to that then? I mean, I think there's a fairly obvious quick answer there, which is philanthropy can help out a bit there. So, I mean, there are, the role of indigenous people in conserving the land, for example, or traditional health, and there's all sorts of traditionally thinking, but seen as a high risk approach. And as you say, these are difficult to get support for, not only financial, but also, on a sort of a global scale. And this is somewhere where we are looking to see where philanthropy can step up. And as I was saying earlier, if you've got a philanthropist, whether it's a sort of large scale foundation or a sort of smaller thing, or a corporate CSR contribution, for example, a lot of people who are doing local community work around their area, who are prepared to take that kind of risk and support their local community and give people a bit of a chance to get their voice and their idea out there and prove what they're doing with a successful pilot, to gather that body of evidence and prove their concept. That's when you can then start to sort of lift things to the next level and go for that kind of investing for impact, and moving it up the scale to access that larger scale investment, which is, where Paloma was talking about, this sort of responsible investing field. I think that's a really key piece there.
Any other thoughts? I think this also speaks to the way in which you're accountable to your key stakeholders and moving away from conventional ways of reporting, perhaps to, as Kamala says, bringing those voices in. And Alex asks, what is the panel's view on companies focusing more on conducting the right ESG related behaviors, protecting the environment, people, communities, operating ethically, aligned to their organizational values, beliefs, than from their thinking about the measurement to demonstrate how they do it?
I think investors and the general public have really expectations that anything that companies measure should have a value. Doesn't necessarily have to be financial. So you can use both qualitative and quantitative measures. You can't box it in. It cannot be all rhetoric. I think the most difficult one that I've seen is on diversity and inclusion, where you can skew the numbers and really massage them and present them as a positive impact for the company. How do you measure voice, right? So you could be having a large diverse organization with 20 ethnicities, 50 nationalities. And so how do you measure the value of inclusion? One way of doing it is to make sure that all voices are heard. So I think there's a tremendous scope for new tools and measurements to be built up, compared with where we are today, where it's very, very traditional, how much staff you have at what level, and gender representation, again, not looking at, and I see that many companies present gender data on an aggregate basis. They don't do that on the level of women senior staff, for example, and what their aspiration is. So I think hopefully there'll be greater pressure on companies to really step up and go the extra mile in disclosure and in creating new metrics in this field.
Jason makes a comment, Vasuki. This should be about what is material for the organization specifically, just as what are the enterprise risks. This is often very different from sectoral materiality. So just a comment there. And then Haley has left the best to last. Apologies, I'm struggling to understand whether this is a way of putting our risk categories into themes to ensure and show we are a conscious company considering environmental and social impact. So, challenge there to frame it for the risk professional. Alex?
Yeah, I mean, in essence, it's hard to see how this isn't one of the top risks in most organizations. Even if you're not exposed directly, then you are through your supply chain or through the pressure to disclose. So even if the risk is ESG indices and not ESG risks themselves, it's something that you need to step up and address. And I think it's just a case of the risk professionals putting that into context. And that means trying to understand the risk drivers, identifying the risks, assessing the impact and likelihood, comparing it to a risk tolerance, and then looking at the controls and whether they're adequate. So it's not a risk to be scared of. It's kind of like any other risk, but it is a non-financial risk.
And together to what Alex was saying, we haven't talked about regulation, but in the past few years, not much. There has been an absolute explosion of regulations related to non-financial issues, mostly in the European Union, but they are not limited to companies of the European Union. Companies that operate in the European Union have to abide by these rules, including the taxonomy reporting, which is going to be exhaustive. So it is first and foremost part of the risk management of a company. And then once that is done, then we can begin talking about this double materiality to then be and deal with the conscious and responsible part of operations, goods and services, which can then even lead into strategic decisions for the company. But at the very basic level, it is, as Alex was saying, is a risk management tool for non-financial risks that is increasingly being pushed not only by access to capital and investors' demands, but by regulation as well.
So any very final thoughts from Hannah or Vasuki? Okay, we've managed to get through all the questions, which was the challenge I thought we might have. But look, if you have any more questions for the panel, my email address is on our ESG webpage. Alex is as well, so you can speak directly to Alex. But for Hannah, Paloma, and Vasuki, please do forward any questions and I will pass them on to them. If you're interested, we have another event coming up on sustainable development and investment on the 3rd of March. You'd need to register for that separately. And also, if you want to become part of our community, you need to register separately. For data protection, we can't contact you just because you've registered for this particular event. And we will be sending a feedback form. We'd be very grateful if you could complete that. So that just leaves me to thank a number of people. Thanks very much to the IRM teams. Thank you everyone for joining, and thank you most of all to our speakers for giving up your time. Appreciate that very much, and thank you everyone.